On today's video, we're going to be ranking Florida's top 10 largest cities. These are Florida's top 10 largest counties representing these 10 cities. The formula for today's video is a combined score of the overdose death rate, the homicide rate, and the incomes for these cities. In overdose death rates, we have the overdose death rate per 100,000. The score is inverted back from the rate totaling 100. For example, in row number 5, you can see that Miami-Dade's overdose death rate was 10 per 100,000, so inverted from 100, that gives Miami a score of 90. On the other hand, Broward and Pinellas, highlighted in yellow, had the highest tied overdose death rates. Thus, they both got 53 as a score, the lowest score in this category. We did the same thing with homicide rates. You can see that Lee County, Florida, that's Fort Myers, had a 3.7, the lowest homicide rate. Inverted back to 100, that gives it the highest score of 63, because 37 plus 63 equals 100. When it comes to homicide rates, Jacksonville or Duval County had 15 per 100,000. Its score is an absolute 0. I would assume that most counties in Florida should be from 10 below. Anything over 10 just disqualifies Jacksonville. The score metric for incomes is 1 per mil. So Palm Beach County had $81,000. It got 81 points. So this is a fairly straightforward mathematical equation that will give us the ranking for today's video. After compiling all our metrics, this is the results that we got. However, we're going to fine tune these results. In each category, the city or county that had the lowest score will be given a 0 for that category. And each city that had the highest score in each category, the best score, will be given 10 extra points. So after our bonus and our adjustment, we get our final results. So the final score I'll share with you guys at the end of the video, but for now, let's start with the ranking. Number 1 was Fort Myers, Lee County, Florida, with a total score of 215. Helping Fort Myers obtain this score, it has the lowest homicide rate, which garnished it an extra 10 points by our metric. When it comes to overdose death rates, Fort Myers was kind of run-of-the-mill, landing somewhere in the middle. Having the lowest homicide rate, Fort Myers quickly got a head start on our list. When it came to incomes, Lee County was kind of in the middle once again. Only Orange, Brevard, Hillsborough, and Broward had higher incomes. With kind of average scores throughout the whole list, the enhancement that it got in points and bonuses for being the lowest homicide rate is really what drove Fort Myers to the top of our list. Now, to be fair, we're looking at the top 10 largest counties in Florida. If we're looking at the top 20 in Florida, places like Manatee and Sarasota would have done far better than Fort Myers. But the results are the results. When it comes to Florida's top 10 largest counties, Fort Myers, according to our metrics of addiction, safety, and incomes, comes out on top by far. This city offers people warm weather throughout the entire year, average cost of living, good safety, and average addiction rates. Now, a few years back, the overdose death rates in Fort Myers would have not landed it in this position. Its most recent overdose death rate is on par with the state average, and it's just kind of like this middle ground that helped Fort Myers concrete its way to the top of our list. It's crazy to think that Miami-Dade, being far more expensive than Fort Myers, still has lower incomes. Number 2 is Miami-Dade County with a score of 204. Miami-Dade had the lowest overdose death rate on our list today. Miami-Dade's overdose death rate is 10 per 100,000, meaning that it scored 90 points for the lowest overdose death rate, plus the 10-point enhancement, bringing that total in that category to 100 out of 100. When it came to incomes, Miami-Dade came at number 7. Considering that Miami-Dade is the most expensive place to live on this list, one could almost argue that if we had included cost of living into today's index, Miami would have definitely fallen from the number 2 spot. The formula that we use for income is 1 point per every $100,000, and the incomes were pretty close to each other. When you look at homicide rates, that's where things vary a lot more. And when you look at overdoses, that's where like the vast difference lays. So when you look at these metrics, Miami was able to get a high score simply because in the category of overdoses, where there's a larger kind of range of numbers, it had the best. Number 3 is West Palm Beach. Palm Beach County's score was 202, trailing right behind Miami. At $81,000, it has the highest income of Florida's larger counties. At $81,000, it got 81 points in that category. It also received a 10-point bonus for having the best incomes. The overdose death rates in Palm Beach County were about average, and so were the homicide rates. It was really its high score in incomes that helped drive it to the top of our list. For the whole state of Florida, 67 counties, Palm Beach's income came in at number 7. With 1.5 million people living in this county, incomes that high, for being just a large area with a large population and good incomes, this makes Palm Beach County a fairly attractive place for people who want to live in a large city that's fairly affluent. Palm Beach County feels like a very beautiful and luxurious place. Out of the counties in Florida that have over 1 million residents, Palm Beach County has the lowest homicide rate. There are 6 counties in Florida that have over 1 million residents, and among them, Palm Beach County has the lowest homicide rate. At 5.5 per 100,000, that is about a third of the chances of you being a victim of a homicide compared to Jacksonville, Florida. Your chances of being a victim of a homicide in Palm Beach County are 1/3 of what it would be in Jacksonville or Nashville. With the exception of Jacksonville, Florida's large cities are known to be safe places with fairly low homicide rate. And while the competition in Florida is pretty tight, Palm Beach also came out good in that category. But without a doubt, its bonus enhancement for having the highest incomes is what landed it high on our list today. Interestingly enough, at number 4, Tampa and Orlando are both tied at 187 points. Respectively, Orange and Hillsborough County came in even on our list. So both counties had a fairly low overdose death rate. For Hillsborough, which is Tampa, it was 30 per 100,000, and for Orange, it's 25 per 100,000. So both of these counties got pretty good points when it comes to low overdoses. Interestingly enough, as metropolitan areas, both Tampa and Orlando are plagued with very high overdose death rates in the suburban counties. But when it comes to the urban cores, Orange and Hillsborough actually did pretty good. It's mostly rural and suburban areas that are going to have the highest overdose death rates. Now, some people argue that it has to do with longer distances and getting Narcan to people. I'm sure that plays a factor, but it doesn't convince me. It's been my experience that rural and suburban areas just have a lot more addiction than city cores. And it probably just comes down to the fact that if you live in a large city, the cost of living is incredible. Real estate is more expensive, everything costs more. People that live in cities simply don't have time to be high all the time. Whether you like it or not, people in rural areas just have a lot more time on their hands and less obligations. Life is easier. They're not as tied up with having to make money for a living, which means that they have more free time to get involved in things that are harmful to them, while people in cities are just too busy trying to work to pay the bills to have time to be stoned all the time. You really might not see this just driving through a rural area. After all, people do their business in private. But if you've lived in the city and in the country like I have, you understand that people in the rural communities just have a lot more time on their hands, and well, they don't always put that free time to good use. When you talk about people living in Miami, Orlando, and Tampa, they just don't have a lot of free time to be stoned and overdosing. People in these cities live very busy lives because of how much money it costs to live there. There really isn't even an opportunity for people living in these expensive cities to be like in a position where they could overdose. So if you're probably scratching your head wondering how these large urban cores came out better than rural areas or smaller places when it comes to overdose death rates, the reality is that because cities are so expensive, people just can't engage in that activity as much. Now, in the case of an economical downturn where cities have higher unemployment rates, then those numbers kind of flip flop and then cities do become worse. But right now, with low unemployment rates and kind of extreme cost of living and inflation, cities are going to have much lower overdose death rates. When it comes to incomes, Hillsborough County came in at number 4. So now we're in the middle of the list. So you're seeing a lot of kind of middle numbers. Now, Hillsborough County has over 1.5 million people. So for them to have a homicide rate of only 5.8, it's kind of like below the national average or right about the national average. That's pretty good for a large city. And like I said, Florida's large cities seem to offer a lot of safety when it comes to having good homicide rates. Now, in the case of Orlando, Orange County, respectively, has the second highest income of Florida's larger counties. Its homicide rate is a little bit higher than Tampa. Orange County's homicide rate was 6.5, but its overdose death rate at only 25 per 100,000 is the second lowest of Florida's large counties. So with Orlando having the second lowest overdose death rate out of these counties, as well as the second highest income, this area definitely has a lot going for it analytically. You just have to remember that on that list, incomes were really close to each other and Orlando didn't get any enhancements. Now, this can be a little bit misleading that Orlando is number 4 on our list because it seems like it would be on the top half of cities. But I want you guys to remember that we're only looking at the top 10 counties in Florida. If we were looking at the top 20 counties in Florida, Orlando wouldn't be in the top half. So for large urban cores, analytically, it's better than others in Florida. But if you start to compare it to smaller counties like Seminole, Nassau, St. John's, Collier, Sarasota, or Manatee County, I don't think Orlando would rank in the top half of these lists. So you have to remember that on today's video, we're looking at the larger cities in Florida. And for the most part, the better places in Florida are not in the top 10, they're in the top 20. So just because Orlando scored really well on our list today doesn't mean that I would personally consider Orlando a place I would want to move to. After all, it's inland, it doesn't have beaches, it has a huge homeless population. It seems like crime in other categories that we're not talking about on today's video is also fairly high in Orlando. So there's a lot of other attributes that we're not covering on today's video. But for the metrics of today's video, this is where Orlando ranked. And that is because, again, its homicide rate's fairly low and it has a very low overdose death rate. And, of course, the second highest incomes on the list. So all that contributes to Orlando ranking fairly high on our list. But if you were to just zoom out and look at a bunch of other things, I personally wouldn't rank Orlando that high. But again, that's the difference between your personal perception and then analytics. Analytics are one thing, and analytics are usually undisputable. So the Orlando area analytically does have a lot to offer. Now, when you were to factor in, let's say, cost of living, that's where things get really dicey because the same exact safety that I have in a coastal town cost the same as Orlando without beaches. So for people considering the Florida lifestyle, it doesn't make sense to pay practically the same amount of money to live in Orlando as you would to live in a beach town. Now you're probably asking yourself, aren't there apartments in Orlando that are much cheaper? Yes, there are. But when you look at what you get as far as safety in those particular apartment complexes, you can find a comparable apartment complex in a coastal town for the same price tag. So you have to compare apples to apples. When you actually compare apples to apples, the cost of living in Orlando is practically the same as a coastal community. And while among our list of today, Orlando had the second highest incomes, Collier and Sarasota, which again are not in the top 10, have better income. So there are better options in Orlando if you look at smaller places. The issue here as well is that Orlando has massive traffic congestion. So if you can practically live in a coastal county where you can make more money and the cost of living when you compare apples to apples is comparable, why would you choose a city like Orlando with a lot of traffic and congestion that doesn't have beaches when you can live in a coastal community and make more? So when you compare apples to apples, you weigh in other factors like being in a beach town, traffic congestion, Orlando really doesn't look that attractive if you start to factor in other categories that do not make up our ranking today. If I had to be the arbitrary here and pick between Orlando and Tampa to make the distinction of which one is better, I would say if you like suburban living, Orlando has a lot better suburban living. But if you like beaches and coastal vibes, food and culture, then at that point Tampa becomes a better option. So I'm not really going to make that determination. I'm just going to say that they're both tied at number 4. And if you like the Orlando package or the Tampa package, these are two very distinct cities in that Orlando offers great suburban living. Tampa doesn't really offer as much of that. Anyways, I just really hate that on today's video, my metric left these two cities tied together. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're picking between Orlando and Tampa, they're very distinct cities. Orlando being inland offers more space, which means more sprawling suburbs. Tampa is definitely more compact with less land available, but it does offer more culture and, of course, beach vibes if that's what you're into. Of course, both of these cities have horrendous traffic, but most of us would agree that Orlando is far worse when it comes to traffic congestion. Number 6 is Broward County, Fort Lauderdale area with a score of 166. So now we're moving to the below average category. Now, considering how beautiful Broward County is and how diverse it is and the food scene there, I would almost feel disappointed that Broward County landed on the bottom half of this list, because I think like Fort Lauderdale really has a lot to offer as a fun, great place to live. I mean, I would say it's definitely more fun than Tampa and Orlando. However, when you start looking at analytics, it draws up a different story. Despite the fact that Broward County has a very low overdose death rate, when you look at their homicide rate, it's a little on the high side. At 8.2 per 100,000, you're now above the state average and 2 times higher than Fort Myers. Now, despite the fact that Broward County is a very expensive place to live, I mean, it's probably almost on par with Miami these days. Counties like Orange, Brevard, and Hillsborough that are much more affordable have better income. So all that starts to draw a different picture of Broward County. But because of its fairly low overdose death rate and run-of-the-mill incomes, it didn't fall further down on our list. It has the second highest homicide rate in Florida among these 10 counties. Only Jacksonville is more dangerous. I think like over the last 10 or 12 years, Miami-Dade's African American and Black population has moved further north into Broward, and that has kind of brought up the homicide rates for Broward. And then on the other end, Palm Beach County has been becoming kind of whiter, so kind of between the Hispanics and the whites pushing the blacks in the Broward County, it's kind of brought up their homicide rates. So what's kind of happening in South Florida these days is that Palm Beach County is becoming increasingly white, Broward's becoming increasingly black, and Miami's becoming increasingly Hispanic. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at tourists, the pattern of tourists visiting Florida differentiates greatly from where people actually live. For example, despite Miami-Dade being mostly Hispanic, most of the black tourists are going to want to go to Miami, not Broward County. The same thing can be said with white tourists. Despite the fact that Palm Beach County has the largest white population of residents, most white tourists are wanting to go to Broward County. Now, black tourists don't go to Broward County, they go to Palm Beach County. So what's interesting about South Florida is that the patterns of where people live and where people vacation vary greatly by race. So that's just a little interesting detail about this area, that the demographics of where people live in South Florida versus the demographics of who visits areas kind of vary greatly. I think overall when people vacation, they kind of look for a change of scenery. So that's probably why like black tourists are more likely to be drawn to Miami, which is Hispanic, versus going to Broward, which is black, probably similar to wherever they're at back up north. So where people live and where people vacation are two completely different things. So the way we as tourists or people visiting might look at this area, like I would look at Broward County as more desirable than Palm Beach and Dade in a lot of ways. But the way we look at it as tourists visiting this area versus the reality of people living in this metropolitan area are just two completely different worlds. So when you look at analytics, Broward County does fall kind of in the lower half of today's list. And I know that's kind of like you're probably at home scratching your head on that one, but that's just the reality of analytics. So you just have to kind of put away your perceptions when you look at analytics and let the numbers speak for themselves. Like for me, moving to Broward County, safety wouldn't even be on my priorities list. Like I wouldn't really pay much attention to safety in Broward County because when I go there as a tourist, I feel very safe. But your perception as a tourist doesn't change the reality of Broward County's homicide problem, which in comparison to other cities in Florida is significantly greater, and it centers mostly around the African American and Black community of Broward County, Florida. So again, it's one of those deals where the way you see things from the outside isn't exactly the way things are. Now, I do want to say this for Fort Lauderdale, okay? Its homicide rate of 8 per 100,000 may be higher than the state average. It may be higher than the national average, but when you compare it to Chicago, Louisville, Atlanta, on and on and on, Fort Lauderdale is a far safer and better city. So compared to other cities in Florida, it doesn't rank that great, but compared to other cities in the country, it's still a top option. So again, you just have to draw a distinction between perception and reality. On today's video, we're looking at just raw numbers. Particularly the cost of living versus incomes here just doesn't add up. I mean, Broward County is extraordinarily expensive, but it doesn't make up for it in any type of way. And I also feel like when it comes to Broward County, there's a huge gap in like the reality of like, let's say like the large Haitian community here and their incomes versus, you know, like the upper crust along the beaches. It's like there's just two completely different worlds, perhaps more polarizing here than in other parts of Florida. Number 7 is St. Petersburg, Florida, Pinellas County with a score of 126. So now we're looking at the top 3 worst of Florida's 10 larger counties. While at the top of today's list, we rewarded counties that had good analytics with a 10-point bonus. At the bottom of the list, we're actually punishing places that had the absolute worst analytics in any category. Now, in the case of this particular county, Pinellas, the St. Petersburg area, they received 0 points in the category of overdoses because at 47 per 100,000, they're tied with Brevard County as the worst overdoses in these counties. So towards the top of the list, those rankings were incentivized. Here at the bottom of the list, we're actually penalizing places that have the worst categories. And among these categories of overdoses, Pinellas County is penalized by having their points stripped away in the category of overdoses. So what we did at the bottom of the list is that the counties that had the worst overdoses and homicide rates, as well as the lowest incomes, were penalized by completely having those points stripped away, and that is our adjusted score. And we did this to kind of thin out the herd and spread out the range of these numbers to make our list more comprehensive on the distinction between the counties that had the best analytics and the counties that had the worst. And well, the issue with Pinellas County is that it has the highest overdose death rates. Along with Brevard tied at 47, both of these counties had their points stripped away for having tied the highest overdose death rates. And that's really a shame because Pinellas County did have the second lowest homicide rate at 4.4. However, because the numbers for those rates are kind of fairly close to each other, the way my ranking is built, it doesn't really incentivize that as much. Among these large counties, Pinellas also has the 7th lowest income. The real issue facing Pinellas County is that consumption rates in this county are very bad. And yes, overall it is a safe county, but they're dealing with a huge consumption issue, and it affects our ranking today. I purposely chose overdoses for a reason. I feel like no matter how many great things you have going on in your community, if you have a lot of consumption, it takes something away from your community, and that's clearly reflected on today's ranking. So with fairly bad incomes and the highest overdose death rates, Pinellas County doesn't offer a lot of incentive to live here. The crazy thing is, when you look at cost of living, other counties that have about the same level of safety plus higher incomes are going to have, well, the same cost of living. So it's one of those deals where like you're paying as much money as living in Bradenton and Sarasota, but then you have all these other analytics like low incomes and more addiction rates, which means that there is somewhere better than Pinellas County. And overall, Pinellas County is not a bad place. It's commendable that their homicide rate is that low. That's among the best in Florida, like second best on our list today. But when you start to look at other categories, it doesn't seem competitive. And well, if you're looking at Florida, the real issue with Pinellas is that it isn't competitive. Yes, it's safe, but then when you start looking at incomes and what it has to offer, it just becomes more and more impractical. Now, if the cost of living in Pinellas County reflected the incomes, then you could say here's an incentive to be here. But that isn't the case. Pinellas County has a lot of overdoses. It has a very high cost of living and fairly difficult place to make money. Now, I will say this. I do gig work in Pinellas County all the time, and it seems like, at least on the gig work side, it seems like you can make quite a lot of money here. And another interesting thing, like when you compare different places, a lot of times different areas have different incomes, not because an area doesn't offer any more, but because the people there aren't willing to work for it. It could just be that the particular demographic of people in Pinellas County isn't interested in making more income. And I say that because in Pinellas County, Hispanics make more money than Lee County, for example. Despite the fact that Pinellas has a larger white demographic and Lee County has a larger Hispanic demographic, just because there isn't a large Hispanic demographic here doesn't exactly mean that if a Hispanic person, for example, wanted to move here, that their incomes wouldn't improve. In the case of somebody moving from Fort Myers, it would improve by the note of about $7,000 a year. And here's another example. Pinellas County is overwhelmingly white, while, for example, Duval County has a large black population. Well, it turns out that blacks are actually going to make more money in Pinellas County than they will in Duval. And despite the fact that Miami is considerably more expensive than Pinellas County, African Americans moving from Miami to Pinellas County are going to have roughly about the same income, despite the fact cost of living vary significantly. So it all depends on how you look at things. But even among the counties listed on today's video, there are still 7 other counties where African Americans are going to make more money than Pinellas. But Pinellas County is kind of landlocked in Florida from an urban core perspective. It has absolutely nowhere to grow but upwards, which means there's not too much income as far as construction and new building, which is a huge source of income for people in Florida. And then the only industry really people have here is tourism, which is along the coast and very seasonal. You just can't forget how seasonal Pinellas County is. So all that makes it really difficult to make or carve out a living year-round in Pinellas County when tourism is the main industry and it's fairly seasonable, meaning that in the summertime, tourism literally disappears, and so do those tourist dollars, which means that people have less hours to work, more time available, which leads to probably why you have higher overdoses. So all these things kind of work together. Number 8 is Jacksonville, Florida. Duval County got a score of 126, and that is tied with St. Petersburg. Now, while Tampa and Orlando were tied on our ranking, when it comes to Jacksonville, despite the fact that the overall score is tied, the ranking isn't going to be. See, I put my score at 100, which means that the highest homicide rate would have recently been 10 per 100,000. But Jacksonville is almost at 15 per 100,000. Means that its homicide rate, the chances of them killing you in Jacksonville, far surpasses even the scale of measurements that we're using on today's video, because it's that abnormally high. In fact, this is kind of like the only abnormality of any of the numbers we're dealing with on today's video. So Jacksonville is being penalized for having the highest homicide rate out of all these counties in Florida, bringing its collective score to 0 for this category. Out of the counties we're comparing, they also have the 9th worst for incomes. So with bad incomes and high crime rates, there really isn't a lot of incentive for Jacksonville to score too high on this list. But I will say this, the cost of living in Jacksonville compared to incomes is probably the best ratio in Florida overall. Regardless, not too many people are going to sacrifice their safety for a more comfortable living economically, especially people considering the state of Florida as a place to live. And then you have the third highest overdose, tied for second actually on this list at 42 per 100,000. That's a freaking high overdose death rate. And what's interesting is that in Jacksonville, the overdose death rates reflected high on the black and the white population, where it's usually just the white population. So there really isn't a lot of incentive to live in Jacksonville, even for African Americans, despite the fact that Jacksonville has a pretty large African American demographic. When you look at incomes for African Americans in Jacksonville, even areas that are predominantly white are going to have better incomes for African Americans, like is the case with a few other counties on this list. Which means that even though Jacksonville has a large black population, it doesn't even incentivize black people living there, which makes you want to scratch your head and wonder if, you have this large black population, shouldn't there be an incentive for black people to live there? There isn't. In fact, when you talk about incomes for African Americans, out of the 10 counties we're talking about today, Jacksonville comes in 9 out of 10. Even Pinellas County, which is overwhelmingly a white county, offers African Americans better incomes. Even Miami-Dade, which is increasingly becoming Hispanic and pushing the black population in the Broward, has higher incomes for blacks than in Duval County. But when you factor in cost of living, the income starts to look more comparable. So economically, like I said, there's an incentive to live in Jacksonville for African Americans when you start to talk about cost of living, but not overall incomes. Now, when you start to talk about incomes, the first thing that comes to mind to me is not so much how much you make, but how you're going to spend it. For example, Pinellas and Duval County, right? Jacksonville, they're tied on our number score, right? They're the same exact number, but what's interesting is that cost of living in Jacksonville is so much more affordable that smaller income in Jacksonville goes a lot further. So you can actually live much more comfortably in Jacksonville with less money than you can in Pinellas County with more. The only difference is that in Pinellas County, the chances of you being a victim of a homicide, your safety, is about 4.4 per 100,000. And in Jacksonville, you're more than 3 times as likely to be a victim of a homicide. So you're just throwing your safety out the window for comfortable living in Jacksonville. It's just a compromise most people are not willing to make. Interestingly, however, 4 out of the 10 best places to live for incomes regarding African Americans are going to be in the outskirts of Jacksonville, including the number 1 spot, St. Johns County, which is just to the south of Jacksonville, where African Americans are on average making more than $100,000 a year. So perhaps the issue of Jacksonville is you gotta live in the suburbs. So I guess that could also indicate that if you're African American, there are opportunities in the Jacksonville area if you want to make good money and live in the suburbs. But you kind of got to draw the distinction between African Americans living in the suburbs of Jacksonville, where they have the highest incomes in the state for African Americans, and of course the African Americans in the inner city of Jacksonville, which are definitely not doing too well. And I could almost speculate somehow that most of those high income African Americans are going to be transplants from other places, and the ones that are stuck in the inner core of Jacksonville are going to be from Florida. So again, you should start to see throughout the state of Florida different class distinctions that reflect in the incomes based on where people are from or their demographics. And it's like that throughout the entirety of the United States. But there's like an extra disparaging factor for these analytics when you talk about African Americans in urban counties in Florida. The good thing is that it's starting to look like there's counties now in the United States where African Americans actually make more than whites. Like Pasco County, which is not on today's list, not by much. It almost would have made the population number. It wasn't far off. In Pasco County, Florida, African Americans actually make more than whites. So again, it's just a matter of where you put yourself. You're going to put yourself in an area where analytics are favorable, or you're going to put yourself in an area where the analytics are almost set to destroy you. Number 9 is Lakeland, Florida, Polk County with a score of 125. You know, I always get a laugh at how people think that Polk County is the greatest place on earth, but anybody that lives in Florida knows that analytically Polk County ain't much. It's known as having low incomes. It's not really the type of place you would actually want to move to. I personally wouldn't want to move here. Yet despite the fact that, the reality of Polk County is a pretty grim one, the perception from people who don't live in Florida is that this is a great place to live based on, I guess, what they see on the media. So it's another one of those places that is vastly misunderstood in Florida. Now, the drug overdose death rate here is fairly low and the homicide rate's fairly low. It's the incomes that are the worst out of the 10 counties we've talked about today. So as per the rules of today's list, because Polk County has the worst incomes in the state, we strip away its points, giving it the awfully bad rank of number 9. What's crazy about Polk County, Florida, is despite the fact that housing here is fairly affordable and so are rents, the incomes are so low that it still isn't enough for people to live, leaving people in a miserable economical outcome despite the fact that it isn't that expensive to live here. It just sucks all the way around. And while overdoses and homicides are not analytically in a bad state, other types of crime are very high and prevalent here, so the general perception of this area isn't a good one when it comes to crime. It just has a trashy feel to it. On top of that, Lakeland in Polk County is the largest concentration of urban poverty in Florida. That's because of its awfully low incomes. So again, the perception of poverty here seems pretty high. Number 10, the absolute worst performing place was Melbourne, Florida, Broward County. With an awfully low score of 114, this place really doesn't have a lot to offer. With the worst score for overdose death rates, it had its points stripped away in that category. The overdose death rate here is 47 per 100,000. And that's actually down significantly. It was higher than that in previous years. This area has a huge overdose problem, predominantly among the white population. Interestingly, though, most police forces here are mostly concentrating their efforts around harassing the African American community, despite the fact it's actually the white population at the core of the overdose crisis. As per our ranking, compared to the other cities on today's video, the homicide rate here is elevated. On top of that, the incomes are kind of mediocre, so this area really doesn't provide any incentive for people to want to live here and think it's a great community, at least analytically speaking. When you talk about cost of living versus incomes, then it starts to look a little bit more attractive, and it's definitely economically more comfortable than other places in Florida. But as those analytics would suggest in overdoses, it's certainly a depressing place to live. A lot of people would say that Melbourne and Fort Myers are very similar cities in a lot of ways, but let's not forget that Fort Myers analytically came out as number 1, and Melbourne, Broward County, analytically came out as number 10. So there's one thing about perceptions is that perceptions, once again, can be very misleading. While on the surface things may look similar, when you start to look at numbers, there's a huge contrast between these two cities, with Fort Myers being superior, much better analytically. Despite Brevard County having the worst overdose death rates for our list today, it was actually a whole lot worse some years back. In fact, it got to the point where for the white population, the overdose death rate was above 70 per 100,000. Alright everybody, thank you for watching today's video. These are our final results with the rankings. You can see highlighted in green the areas where cities received bonuses, and highlighted in yellow the areas where cities had subtractions. I hope that my video was understandable. I mean, the metrics that we're using are pretty straightforward. Homicides, overdoses, and incomes to create a fairly understandable ranking for these cities with analytics that are pretty solid and difficult to argue with. So with the work that I put into today's video, you should have a pretty good idea of how Florida's largest cities and counties compare to one another. And I think that we can also agree that different demographics in the United States are facing different challenges. For the Hispanic communities like Miami, it's simply the cost of living doesn't add up. For the African American communities in Broward and Duval, it's the amount of homicides and violence that's plaguing that community. And for the white communities like Brevard and, of course, Pinellas, these areas are dealing with overdoses. So we can see how in the United States, different demographics are dealing with different problems. Hispanics with cost of living in the cities that we're at. African Americans have to contend with violence, and the white population is dealing with addiction. It's just really interesting how these metrics of analytics highlight the challenges that different people are dealing with and how that plays out into the bigger scope of the analytics and overall rankings of the cities here in Florida. Is there anything you would have personally done different if this was your list that you were making? I really considered creating a cost of living index for rental property values and then using that as another contributing factor to our list. And the way I would have done that, had I incorporated cost of living, renting itself, it would have been like something along the lines of assuming that $2,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, it would have to be, of course, a new construction because it has to be kind of a apples to apples comparison. But basically, anything below 2,000 would add points, and anything above 2,000 would subtract points, evenly the same way, every 100 being a tenth of a percentage, just like I did with these analytics. I could have drawn up a very comprehensive and easy to understand metric for cost of living index based off of what a 2-bedroom apartment would rent for. Like I said, anything below $2,000 would be extra points. Anything above that would deduct. But the issue with doing that is even when you compare apples to apples, it's the actual analytics of crime and safety that kind of determine where you fall along the cost brackets. In other words, there are options in Orlando for $1,700 and there's options in Orlando for $2,600, and the variable that determines where that price tag will fall is the crime analytics. For example, if you're renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Orlando and Lake Nona, it might be $2,600. In a bad part of Orlando, the same exact apartment, right, apples to apples, that same apartment could be as low as $1,700. It's the same apartment, but you're paying more money because of the perception of crime based on homicide rates, overdose rates, and other types of crime. So what I'm trying to tell you is, even if I did create a metric, that would vary from one part of the city to the next. For example, Orlando would be a perfect example in that Lake Nona, for example, that apartment would be $2,600 a month. Or Winter Park, it would be $2,500. But that same exact apartment, put it in the wrong part of Orlando, and now it's more affordable than any of the other affordable cities. So it's not really apples to apples. It's really what crime analytics determine. And the way I would explain it is like this. I was talking to somebody recently who said they're going to move to Knoxville, Tennessee because they can get an apartment for $1,500 or $1,600, right? Now, this person lives in the Sarasota, Bradenton area. It's an Uber passenger that I had there. I'm moving to Knoxville, Tennessee because I can get an apartment for $1,600. And I told them, well, you can get an apartment in Arcadia, 45 minutes away or an hour away, for $1,500. Would you move to Arcadia? The person was like, oh, I would never move to Arcadia. I'm like, well, Knoxville's just a giant Arcadia. So, you get what you pay for. So the notion of moving somewhere else, like moving to another city because the mathematical equation in that city is better, today equates to the reality of, would you move to a bad neighborhood in your current city to lower your rents? Like, for example, I wouldn't move into a bad part of Bradenton to save money on rent. So why would I move to Jacksonville to save on rent? It just doesn't make sense. And that's why you can't really compare apples to apples when you talk about cost of living when you make these indexes. So let's suppose in my case, let's say I told myself, well, if I move to Jacksonville, my rent will go down by $600 or $700 a month. I'm like, well, what am I trading off? Well, my safety, right? But, there's places right in the city that I live in now that are in that price range, and the reason I wouldn't move to those areas is crime and safety. So why would I move to a whole nother city when I'm going to deal with the same exact variable? And I know that's hard for you guys to understand that because a lot of people are just under the impression that, move to a city that's more affordable. But you can actually find the same exact package in the current city you're in right now. The only difference is that you're actually familiar with the city you're in right now, And if I told you, well, you can move to a bad part of the city you live in now and save money, you would probably say no to that. So when you move to another city somewhere else, it's the same exact variable. The only difference is that you don't understand why it's more affordable. But in the case of the city you currently live in, you understand why a certain part of the city is more affordable, and you would probably pass on it. So the only difference is, at least in your hometown, you understand what the variable is. But when you move to another city that's more affordable, you probably don't understand why it's more affordable, but you'll find out eventually.